"Dad, stop bringing this garbage out here to embarrass me," Rhett roared, hurling the antique silver compass straight into the trash can in the middle of the lobby of the most expensive country club in Charleston. He jabbed a finger in my face, contempt blazing in his eyes. "Starting tomorrow, your care account is cut off completely. You move down to the shed behind the garden, and you never show your face in front of my partners again." I looked at my son, then at my daughter-in-law, Cressida, smirking behind her martini glass. I didn't say a single word. I quietly turned my back and walked away. I am Winston Farraday, and this is how I taught my ungrateful son the harshest lesson of his life. If you love stories about karma and justice finally served, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. The chandeliers of the Ashboro Country Club threw a warm golden light over the tables, but to me it felt like the harsh beam of an interrogation lamp. This was the most expensive club in Charleston, the kind of place where a bottle of sparkling water cost more than most people's lunch. We were there to celebrate my grandson, Beau, turning 10 years old. The private dining room was filled with the city's elite, business partners of my son, Rhett, socialite friends of my daughter-in-law, Cressida, and men in tailored suits who measured each other's worth by the weight of their watches. I sat near the edge of the long table, trying to take up as little space as possible. My navy blazer was 15 years old, the elbows shining thin, a stark contrast to the Italian silk jacket draped over Rhett's shoulders. He sat at the head of the table, laughing too loudly at a joke from a hedge fund manager, pouring champagne like it was tap water. "Grandpa," Beau whispered, tugging my sleeve. His eyes were wide and round, the only honest thing in that entire room. "Did you bring it?" I smiled, feeling the familiar crinkle around my eyes. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket, my hand trembling slightly, not from age, but from a strange mixture of hope and dread. I pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was an antique silver compass, 92 years old, engraved on the inside of the lid with 4 words my own father had carved by hand: "Always find true north." "Happy birthday, Beau," I said softly, placing it in his palm. "This will always show you the right direction, no matter how lost you feel." Beau's face lit up with a smile so genuine it nearly broke my heart. But before his small fingers could close around the compass, a hand snatched it out of his grip. It was Rhett. He held it up between 2 fingers like it was a piece of dirty tissue. "A compass," he announced, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Dad, are you serious? We are at Ashboro. The valet tip alone is more than this scrap of metal is worth." The conversation around us died. I kept my voice low, trying to salvage whatever dignity I had left. "It belonged to your great-grandfather, Rhett. It's not about the price. It's about teaching him that direction matters more than speed." "Direction," Rhett scoffed, turning the compass over in his hand like it disgusted him. "Look around you, old man. This dinner alone cost $12,000. That is a lesson in value. This rusted junk is not a gift. It is an insult to my son and to me." He turned and hurled it across the room. It struck the rim of the ice bucket, chilling the champagne, and clattered onto the marble floor. "Stop bringing this garbage out here to embarrass me," he hissed. Cressida leaned toward the woman beside her, her voice a stage whisper meant for the whole table. "You have to forgive him. He's getting a little confused these days. We let him live with us out of pure charity, but he just doesn't understand how the world works anymore. Honestly, he's become such a burden." A few uncomfortable, polite chuckles rippled around the table. They looked at me with pity. The poor old father living off his successful son. The leech. I looked at Beau. He was staring down at his plate, his face burning red with shame, his lower lip trembling. He wanted to cry, but he already knew his mother would pinch his arm under the table if he ruined the evening. I slowly pushed my chair back. The leg scraped against the marble floor, a harsh grating sound in the sudden silence. "Where are you going?" Rhett snapped, annoyed. "We haven't cut the cake yet. Don't make a scene." "I'm tired," I said quietly. "I'm going home." "Fine," Suit yourself." He waved a dismissive hand. "But don't expect the driver. He's busy tonight. Take the bus. It's cheaper. That's more your speed anyway." I walked out of that dining room with my back straight, feeling every pair of eyes follow me, hearing the whispers trail behind like smoke. I walked past the maitre d', who glanced at my worn shoes with barely concealed disdain. I stepped out into the humid Charleston night, but I didn't walk toward the bus stop. I walked to the far corner of the parking lot, past the Ferraris and the Bentleys, to where my 15-year-old pickup truck sat hidden in the shadows so it wouldn't lower the property value of the lot. I had just unlocked the door when I heard footsteps running up behind me. For one foolish second, a small and hopeful part of me thought it was Rhett, coming to apologize, coming to admit he'd gone too far. I thought maybe the boy I had raised was still buried somewhere under all that arrogance. "Give me the keys," he said, palm open. "This is my truck, Rhett. I bought it before you were born." "And who pays for the gas, the insurance, the repairs?" "I do. Everything you have is because of me. You live in my house, you eat my food, and tonight you embarrassed me in front of my investors." He snatched the keys from my hand. "You're grounded, old man. Starting tomorrow, you don't leave the estate, and that $400 monthly allowance is canceled. You want to act like a child? I'll treat you like one." I looked at him standing there in his $5,000 suit, twirling my truck keys on one finger, and I remembered the day he was born. I remembered holding him in the hospital, promising him the entire world. I remembered 8 years ago, sitting him down in the corner office of Farraday Maritime Holdings, the shipping company I had built from a single leased barge into an empire that moved freight along half the eastern seaboard. I remembered handing him the keys to that empire with only one condition: "Take care of the company, son, and take care of me when I'm old. Show me respect and everything I built is yours." He had cried, he had hugged me, he had promised. "You've made a mistake tonight, Rhett," I said, my voice steady despite the fire building in my chest. "The only mistake I made was not putting you in a home years ago," he spat back. "Now walk. It's a long way to the shed. Maybe it'll give you time to think about how lucky you are that I still put up with you." He turned and strode back toward the warm glow of the club, twirling my keys, not once looking back at Beau's crumpled face in the window. I stood alone in the dark. The Charleston air was thick and heavy, but I felt strangely light. It was a 2-mile walk back to the estate along the marsh road, and I did not feel my 74 years in a single step. For 5 years I had made excuses for my son. I told myself it was the stress of running a company. I told myself it was Cressida's influence, her expensive taste, her cold ambition. I told myself he would grow up eventually. Tonight, standing in that dark parking lot with the smell of pluff mud and salt water in the air, every excuse I had ever made for him quietly died. I reached down, picked the crumpled note of my dignity off the pavement of my own mind, and started walking home with the rhythm of a man who had once negotiated with dock workers' unions and stared down hostile corporate takeovers without blinking. I reached the estate a little after midnight. It was a sprawling property on the edge of the marsh, with manicured lawns and a 12-foot iron gate. Rhett and Cressida lived in the main house, 10 bedrooms with heated floors. I lived in a converted garden shed behind the pool house, a space Cressida had suggested years ago, claiming it would be easier on my knees than the stairs in the main house. I knew the real reason. They wanted me close enough to babysit and far enough away that they never had to look at me. I stepped inside my shed. It smelled of damp cedar and old paint. I sat on the edge of my narrow bed in the dark, and for the first time in 5 years, I did not feel like a tired old man waiting to die quietly. I felt like a general the night before a battle he had already won in his mind 5 years earlier, simply waiting for his enemy to hand him the final excuse he needed to strike. I did not sleep that night. I sat on the edge of my narrow bed in the shed, listening to the cicadas outside, until the anger in my chest hardened into something colder and far more useful. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I stood up, knelt by the small closet, and pried up the loose floorboard beneath my left shoe rack. Taped to the underside, wrapped twice in plastic, was a small black flash drive. This was my insurance policy. This was the lever I had prayed for 8 years that I would never have to pull. When I handed Farraday Maritime Holdings over to Rhett, I had not simply signed the company away. My lawyer, Alden Crowley, had drafted a revocable family trust with a single, very specific instrument buried in Section 14. We called it privately the Doomsday Clause. Rhett believed he owned the shares, the house, the accounts. In truth, he was only ever the beneficiary. I remained the grantor, and as grantor I retained the absolute right to freeze or revoke every privilege at any time for any documented act of gross misconduct against a family member. Publicly humiliating me at Beau's birthday in front of dozens of witnesses and cutting off my care while ordering me into a garden shed was misconduct on record. I walked to the small desk in the corner, pulled out an old laptop that Rhett assumed was broken and worthless, and powered it on. It was not broken. It was a satellite-linked terminal that bypassed the main house's network entirely, a precaution Alden had insisted on years earlier. I inserted the flash drive. The screen glowed blue in the dark shed, illuminating my face. Then I picked up a prepaid phone I kept hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of an old shipping manual on my shelf and dialed a number I had not called in 5 years. It rang once. "Yes," a gravelly, wide-awake voice answered. It was Alden. He never slept before midnight, and he certainly wasn't sleeping now. "It's Winston," I said. A pause. Then, without a trace of surprise in his voice, "Is it time?" "It's time," I said. "Rhett crossed the line tonight. He humiliated me in front of 40 people. He hurt Beau's feelings on his own birthday, and he told me to stop bringing garbage into his life." I heard the soft click of a lighter on the other end, followed by the slow exhale of cigar smoke. "What are your instructions, Winston?" "Execute the clause," I said, staring at the framed photograph of my late wife Lenora on the desk beside me. "I want a full emergency freeze, not a warning. A total freeze." "Understood," Alden said. "The trust accounts, the operating capital, the personal cards, all of it," I ordered. "Freeze the corporate accounts pending an emergency audit for cause. Freeze the personal checking, the savings, the credit lines. Suspend the utility contracts on the main house. They're all billed through the trust anyway. And Alden, draft the eviction notice on the house itself. Give them 24 hours. It will be filed with the court the moment it opens tomorrow morning," Alden said. "And you, old friend, what about you?" "I'm leaving," I said. "Tonight. I have a place already prepared." "Do you need extraction?" "No," I said. "I have a plan of my own. Just make sure every account reads 0 before he pours his morning coffee." "Consider it done," Alden said, and the line went dead. I closed the laptop. I did not pack photographs. I did not pack clothing beyond the single suitcase I had quietly stowed in my truck's toolbox weeks earlier, the night I first suspected this evening might come. I left behind everything that had tied me to 5 years of quiet humiliation. I walked over to where I had smoothed out the crumpled note of my own dignity earlier that night in my mind, and instead I smoothed out something real. I retrieved the silver compass from where I had slipped it into my coat pocket back at the ice bucket before anyone noticed, and I placed it gently in the center of my pillow. Then I took a pen and a single sheet of paper and wrote, "You said this was your money, Rhett. You said this was your house, your life, your empire. You were wrong. None of it was ever yours. It was mine. And tonight I'm taking it back." I left the note folded beside the compass. I walked out of the shed door and into the humid Charleston night. I passed the 4-car garage where Rhett's collection of European sports cars slept under fitted covers. I passed the infinity pool where Cressida hosted her lavish charity galas twice a year. I reached the iron gate, pressed my thumb against the old sensor that still recognized me as the original owner of the property and stepped through it without looking back. By the time the sun rose over the marsh, my son would wake up believing himself untouchable, and I would already be a ghost. I stood at the gate for one long moment before I let it swing shut behind me. Somewhere in that dark house, my grandson was sleeping, probably still clutching the memory of the compass that had been ripped from his hands hours earlier. I thought about turning back, about carrying him out with me that very night. But Alden had warned me, rightly, that removing a child from his parents' home without a court order, however good my intentions, would hand Rhett and Cressida every advantage in the custody fight I already knew was coming. I had to be patient. I had to let the law do what love alone could not. I pressed my palm flat against the cold iron bars for a second, a silent promise, and then I walked away. I had a driver waiting 2 blocks down the road, a man named Otis, who had worked the docks for me for 30 years before retiring, loyal to a paycheck that still, quietly, came from me. He drove me to a private hangar 40 minutes outside the city. Waiting there, standing at the base of the stairs of my old Gulfstream, in a charcoal suit despite the hour, was Alden Crowley himself, a tablet already glowing in his hand. "It's done," Alden said as I approached. "Total freeze, effective at midnight. The eviction filing goes before Judge Halston at 8 sharp. And I've already spoken with the district accountant about launching a formal audit into the corporate card statements for the last 3 years." "Good," I said, climbing the stairs slowly, feeling every one of my 74 years in my knees, but none of it in my resolve. "What about the boy?" "We have private security watching the estate discreetly," Alden said. "Bo will be safe, but Winston, he needs to see some of this unfold. It's the only way to save him from becoming his father." I nodded, though the thought of my grandson watching any part of what was coming sat like a stone in my chest. Alden must have seen it on my face, because his tone softened for the first time all night. "Winston, you didn't do this to him. He did this to himself 5 years ago, the day he decided your love came with a shelf life. Every man in that dining room tonight saw exactly who Rhett has become. You are simply the only one with the means to make him answer for it." I said nothing. There was nothing left to say. I settled into the leather seat as the engine began to hum to life beneath us. "Take us up," I told the pilot. "Where to, sir?" "New York," I said. "I have a war room to set up." As the plane taxied down the runway, I pulled a second tablet from my bag, one already linked to the security feed inside the main house. I watched Rhett's bedroom light flicker on for a moment, then off again, oblivious, still asleep, still believing that tomorrow would begin exactly like every other morning of his comfortable borrowed life. I closed my eyes as the wheels lifted off the tarmac and Charleston fell away into darkness beneath us. Phase 1 was complete. The money was already gone, even if he didn't know it yet. Phase 2, the collapse, was about to begin, and for the first time in 5 years, I intended to watch every second of it. The Charleston sun rose the next morning over a mansion with no coffee and no hot water. I had made certain of that. The Italian espresso machine that cost more than a compact car sat cold and silent on the marble kitchen island, because I was the only person in that house who had ever known how to operate it. And I was 74 miles away by then, watching everything unfold through a tablet linked to the estate's own security cameras Rhett had installed to watch me, never once imagining I might one day watch him instead. Rhett stumbled into the kitchen at 7:15 sharp, exactly on his usual schedule, expecting his coffee waiting on the marble like it had every single morning for 5 straight years. He found nothing. He rang the small bell mounted on the wall, the one connected to an intercom that used to buzz in my shed. Silence answered him. He rang it again harder, cursing under his breath, then finally shuffled toward the machine himself, jabbing buttons he had never once bothered to learn. It refused to obey him. He reached for his phone instead, probably to summon a housekeeper to fix his coffee crisis. And that was when the first domino fell. A red banner dropped across his screen. I knew exactly what it said because I had scheduled the transfer myself to execute the moment the markets opened. Liquidity alert. Unauthorized executive withdrawal flagged. $18 million in operating capital moved to a holding account, authorized by the grantor. I watched the blood drain from my son's face through the grainy overhead feed. He dropped the phone onto the counter and snatched it back up, tapping frantically, trying to reverse a transaction that no bank on earth would reverse for him, because the bank answered to the trust, and the trust answered only to me. Upstairs, Cressida's scream echoed down the marble staircase loud enough to distort the audio on my tablet. The water in her heated shower had cut off mid-rinse, shampoo still in her hair, because the utility contracts for that house had never once been in Rhett's name. They belonged to the Farraday family trust, and Alden Crowley was, as always, extremely efficient. By 9 that morning, Alden himself had arrived at the corner office of Farraday Maritime Holdings, with 2 former linebackers I had employed as security for decades, men whose paychecks now, once again, came directly from me. Rhett was stripped of his CEO title on the spot, informed that the board, meaning me and only me, had voted him out for cause at the 8 o'clock opening bell. He was escorted out of the building he had walked into every day for 5 years as though he owned it, and deposited on the sidewalk in his silk pajamas, having never even had the chance to change. He tried calling Alden's office from a borrowed phone. He got a recorded eviction notice instead, giving him and Cressida 24 hours to vacate a house that had never legally belonged to either of them. By that evening, they were checked into a roadside motel 40 minutes outside the city, paid for with cash from a watch Rhett had pawned for a fraction of its worth. I watched through a hidden listening device Alden's team had planted, while the 2 of them argued with the motel clerk over the nightly rate. What I overheard next confirmed everything I had feared about the woman my son had married. "You are useless," Cressida hissed at him, not even bothering to lower her voice. "I married a CEO. I married a man who ran an empire. Look at you now. You're a beggar in a motel room that smells like an ashtray." "It's temporary," Rhett muttered, staring at a water stain on the ceiling. "I'll fix this. I just need to talk to him." "He hates you," Cressida spat. "And honestly, I don't blame him. You let a 74-year-old man living in a garden shed take everything from us in one single night. You should have declared him incompetent years ago, the moment he handed you those keys." Rhett looked up at her, something breaking behind his eyes. "I loved him." "And look where that got you," she laughed, a hard, ugly sound. "I didn't marry you for love, Rhett. I married you for the lifestyle. That was always the arrangement. And now you've breached the contract." She pulled a second phone from her handbag, one I had never seen before, a burner Alden's team had actually flagged months earlier, but let run quietly, curious exactly where the rats were hiding their stash. "What are you doing?" Rhett asked, watching her tap furiously at the screen. "Leaving," she said simply. "I have options you don't know about." I leaned forward in my chair, watching the data packet she was sending travel across the network in real time on my own linked monitor. For nearly 3 years, it turned out, Cressida had been quietly skimming funds from every renovation budget, every charity gala, every allowance Rhett had ever handed her, siphoning it slowly into an account in the Cayman Islands. $2 million untouched, waiting for exactly this moment. She had a personal trainer named Diego already waiting for her in a villa outside Zurich, and she intended to be on a flight there before midnight. She pressed the transfer button, her manicured finger trembling with anticipation. I watched the request hit the offshore server. I watched it request authorization. And I watched my trap, quietly set weeks earlier by Alden as a routine precaution against exactly this kind of betrayal, snap shut around her wrist like a steel cuff. "What is this?" she whispered, staring at her screen. "It says frozen. It says funds seized by the Farraday Family Trust. Authorization code, requested by the grantor." Rhett began to laugh, a low, broken, disbelieving sound that built into something almost hysterical. "He found it," he wheezed. "He found your exit strategy, too." "It was my money," Cressida screamed, hurling the burner phone against the motel wall hard enough to crack the screen. "I earned that. I stole that fair and square." "It was never yours," Rhett said quietly, all the fight suddenly draining out of his voice. "It was his money. It was always his money. Even the money you stole from me was his money first." He looked at his wife then, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years, and I watched something curdle behind his eyes on the grainy feed, something that looked almost like recognition. They sat in that cheap motel room together and apart at the same time. Two people who had built their entire lives on money that had never once belonged to either of them, now reduced to screaming at one another over the scraps of a fortune that no longer existed. I thought back, sitting in my hotel suite in New York, to the morning 8 years earlier, when I had handed Rhett the keys to that corner office. I remembered how his hands had shaken as he signed the transfer papers, how he had promised me, tears in his eyes, that he would never let me down. I had believed him completely. I had wanted to believe him. A father wants nothing more in this world than to believe his son is better than the world will eventually prove him to be. Watching him now, stripped of his title, sitting in a motel that reeked of stale cigarettes and cheap disinfectant, I felt no triumph. I felt only the slow, grinding ache of a wound that had been years in the making, finally torn all the way open. Alden called around midnight to update me on the eviction. The sheriff's department had served the notice at the mansion precisely on schedule. Every item in the house, down to the last silver spoon, had already been catalogued by his team that afternoon, a quiet warning that nothing was to leave with them that did not belong to them. I asked him one final question before I let him go for the night. "How is the boy?" "Beau is with a neighbor for now," Alden said. "Confused, frightened, but safe. Winston, I have to say this plainly. Rhett has nothing left to lose now. Men like that do not simply accept defeat. They look for leverage. And the only leverage he has left in this world is that little boy." I closed the tablet cover. It was brutal to watch. It was also, I told myself, exactly what 5 years of quiet cruelty had earned them both. But I already knew Rhett well enough to understand this would not be the end of his fighting. A cornered man does not simply lie down. He bites. And I had a terrible, certain feeling that the next thing my son reached for, when the money was truly gone, would not be a lawyer. It would be my grandson. Alden's warning proved correct within 24 hours. Through the same listening device still planted in the motel room, I heard my son stop pacing and start plotting, and the sound of it chilled me far more than his screaming ever had. "We can't beat him with lawyers," Rhett said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "Alden's got the courts tied up tight. By the time we get a hearing, we'll be sleeping in the truck. We need a shortcut." "What kind of shortcut?" Cressida asked from the corner, nursing a cup of stale vending machine coffee. "He's the grantor. He holds every card. But he's 74 years old, Cressida, and he's alone. We don't need to beat him in court. We just need to control him." I leaned closer to the speaker in my hotel suite, my stomach already tightening. "We get him declared incompetent," Rhett continued, his voice dropping into something low and conspiratorial. "We find him. We say he's had a breakdown, that he wandered off confused. We take him to Dr. Fenn." I knew that name. Osgood Fenn was a disgraced physician who had lost his license twice for overprescribing controlled substances, operating out of a strip mall clinic on the edge of the county, the kind of man who would sign whatever paper you put in front of him if the number attached was large enough. "We pump him full of sedatives," Rhett said. "We make him compliant. We put a pen in his hand and guide his signature onto a power of attorney. Once I have that signature, I reverse the trust. I fire Alden. I take it all back. And then?" Cressida asked, her voice devoid of any moral hesitation, only cold practicality. "Then we put him in a facility," Rhett said. High walls, no visitors, keep him medicated. We get our life back. It was a solid plan. Evil, but solid. It relied entirely on one advantage they believed they held: my age and the outside world's willingness to assume a sudden disappearance meant dementia rather than deliberate strategy. But they did not know where I was, and my digital footprint had gone completely dark the moment I left Charleston. Rhett made a call from a gas station burner phone to a man named Tate Buford, a private investigator who had been quietly removed from the county sheriff's department years earlier for planting evidence in a case that never should have gone to trial. Buford was cheap, he was dirty, and he was exactly the kind of man who would ask no questions about a son hunting his own father. "Find him," Rhett ordered into the phone. "Check the private airfields. Check the hotels near the marina. I don't care what it costs. I'll pay you the moment I get the trust back." I sat back in my chair, feeling the temperature of the entire situation shift. Rhett was no longer simply trying to survive. He was hunting me, and Buford would need time and leverage to find a ghost. "He loves the boy," Cressida said suddenly, and I heard something in her voice sharpen into calculation. "That's his weak spot. He blew up his entire life over a $50 compass because of how Bo reacted. If he thinks Bo is in danger, he'll come out of hiding." A chill went through me that had nothing to do with the hotel air conditioning. They left the motel 20 minutes later. I picked up my phone immediately to call the private security I had already quietly stationed near Bo's school, but the legal machinery of the courts was still moving too slowly. The restraining order Alden had filed that morning sat on a judge's desk, unsigned. Legally, in the eyes of the state, Rhett was still the boy's father. Legally, he still had every right to walk onto that playground. I watched through the school's own security feed, which Alden's team had gained temporary access to, as Rhett pulled up along the fence line during afternoon recess. He didn't go through the front office. He waited by the chain-link fence near the swings, and when Bo spotted him and ran over, delighted, thinking his father had simply come to surprise him, Rhett lifted him straight over the low fence and into the back seat of a rented sedan before the playground monitor even had time to react. They didn't drive far. They stopped at an empty riverside park I recognized from summers long past. I tracked the burner phone's location while dispatching my own security, though they were still 18 minutes out. Rhett turned around in the driver's seat and held up his phone. "Okay, buddy," he said, his voice suddenly gentle in a way that made my skin crawl. "I need you to do something for Daddy. Grandpa's lost. He's sick, and we need to find him. If you send him a message, maybe he'll see it." "I'm scared," Bo said, his lip already trembling. "I want Grandpa." "Good," Rhett said. "Use that. Look at the camera. Beg him." He hit record. Bo looked into the lens, confused and frightened. "Grandpa," he said softly, "please come home." "Louder!" Rhett snapped, and I watched, my whole body going cold, as he reached back and gripped his own son's arm, squeezing hard enough that Bo yelped in genuine pain. Real tears rolled down his cheeks. "Please," Bo sobbed. "I'm scared. Please come get me." Rhett stopped recording, satisfied, and posted the video to every platform he could reach within minutes, tagging local news stations, captioning it a desperate plea from a heartbroken family for a beloved, ailing grandfather to come home. I sat frozen in my hotel suite, watching my grandson's real tears on a screen, tears caused entirely by his own father's cruelty. When the video finished, I rewound it frame by frame and froze it on the moment Rhett's grip tightened around Bo's small arm. There, blooming faintly on his pale skin, was a reddish, crescent-shaped bruise, the unmistakable shape of a fingernail pressed hard into flesh. Something inside me that had been holding on for 5 years, some final thread of hope that my son might still be redeemable, snapped clean and quiet, like a rope giving way under too much weight. I had made excuses for Rhett for 40 years. I had blamed his mother's early death, the boarding schools, my own long absences building the company. Looking at that bruise, I understood with total clarity that there was no version of my son left worth excusing. "Alden," I said, my voice flat and cold in a way that startled even me. "Change the classification. This is no longer a financial dispute. I want kidnapping and child endangerment charges filed immediately. I want him buried under every statute the state has on the books." "It will be done within the hour," Alden said quietly. "But Winston, if we send police to that motel while he still has the boy with him, he may panic. He may run." "Then we don't send police to the motel," I said, already standing, already reaching for the charcoal suit I had left hanging in the closet, the one that had waited 5 years for exactly this moment. "We give him what he wants. He wants to find me. So we let him." Alden hesitated on the other end of the line. "You mean lure him? That's dangerous, Winston. He's already shown he's willing to hurt that boy for a camera. I don't like putting you within arm's reach of a man that desperate." "I don't like it either," I said, buttoning my shirt with hands that were, for the first time in 5 years, not entirely steady. "But Rhett trusts Buford's information more than he trusts anything else right now, because it feels like leverage. He found himself, not something I handed him. If we leak my location through Buford instead of the police, he'll walk straight into it, believing he's the hunter. Call the hospital administrator. Tell him I'm coming in for a private evaluation, and tell him I need his full cooperation for a matter of, let's say, considerable importance to the pediatric wing's future endowment." "And Bo?" Alden asked. "The moment Rhett believes he's found me, Bo becomes irrelevant to him," I said, tying my tie in the mirror, watching a tired, defeated old man in the glass slowly transform back into someone I recognized. "He'll bring the boy along only because Cressida will insist on the optics of a united, worried family. That's our window. The second they walk through those doors, I want Bo physically separated from both of them before anything else happens." I looked at the frozen image of my grandson's bruised arm one last time, and I let it settle into my chest like a stone I intended to carry for the rest of my life. "You touched him, Rhett," I said quietly to the empty hotel room. "That is the line. There is no coming back from that line." The private VIP wing on the 12th floor of Charleston General had once been reserved for the mayor's mother during her final illness, and I had donated generously enough to the hospital over the decades that Dr. John Arris, the administrator, owed me favors he could never fully repay. He looked nervous when I walked into his office, in my charcoal suit, looking nothing like a confused old man wandering the halls. "Winston, this is highly irregular," he said, shaking my hand. "Using my hospital as bait for a family confrontation." "It's necessary, John," I said. "And don't worry. The pediatric wing endowment I promised last spring, I'll double it." He swallowed and nodded. "The floor is secure. My security team is briefed. Plainclothes officers are already stationed in the cafeteria and the stairwell." Alden had made the leak to Tate Buford exactly as planned. An anonymous tip that a confused, wealthy old man matching my description had checked into the private wing under a false name, wandering, disoriented, asking for his son. Buford, hungry for the payday Rhett had promised him, had passed it along within the hour, dressing it up as a personal breakthrough, careful to leave out any mention of the anonymous caller who had actually handed it to him. It was a small, ugly little lie, one more link in a chain of them, but it was exactly the kind of lie a desperate man wanted to believe. I sat behind the tinted glass of the administrator's office, watching the entrance camera feed, with Alden beside me, adjusting his cufflinks, his lawyerly composure unusually strained. 40 minutes passed before a battered rental sedan screeched to a halt in the drop-off zone, half on the curb, ignoring every posted sign. Rhett stepped out first. He looked unwell, his suit wrinkled from days of sleeping in it, his eyes carrying the manic sheen of a man running on nothing but desperation. He circled to the passenger side and pulled Cressida out, who in turn dragged Bo by the wrist. My grandson looked exhausted, clutching a small toy truck like it was the last solid thing left in his world. Behind them climbed a small, oily man clutching a black medical bag to his chest like it contained gold. Dr. Osgood Fenn had arrived. They pushed through the sliding doors into the main lobby. Rhett scanned the room frantically, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for a frail, confused old man he could easily overpower. He found the reception desk instead. "Where is he?" he demanded, slamming his palm against the counter. "Winston Farraday. He was admitted an hour ago. I'm his son. I'm his medical proxy." The receptionist, briefed personally by Eris that morning, widened her eyes with practiced innocence. "Sir, please lower your voice. Mr. Farraday is resting in the East Wing solarium. He's been very agitated. We're waiting on a specialist." "I brought my own specialist," Rhett said, gesturing to Fenn. "We're going up." I stood, buttoned my jacket, and checked my reflection in the glass one final time. I did not look like a man about to be sedated against his will. I looked like the man who had once negotiated freight contracts with 3 different port authorities in a single week and walked away with the better end of every one of them. "Let's go, Alden," I said, and we walked down the corridor toward the solarium together, my footsteps steady and unhurried on the polished tile. I could hear them ahead of me before I could see them, Rhett's ragged breathing, Cressida's heels clicking rapidly, and beneath it all, the soft, frightened whimper of my grandson being pulled along too fast for his small legs. They rounded the corner into the wide, sunlit solarium, filled with potted ferns and rain-streaked glass, and found it empty except for a single figure seated in a wheelchair by the window, wrapped in a thick blanket, facing away from the door. "Where is he?" Rhett shouted, spinning in place. "He was supposed to be here." "This feels wrong," Cressida said, her voice rising with sudden panic. "It's too quiet." "Check the rooms," Rhett barked at Fenn. "He's hiding. He's scared. Have the syringe ready. The second you see him, sedate him. I don't want a scene. I want him unconscious and signing papers within the hour." Fenn's hands trembled slightly as he unzipped his bag and drew out a loaded syringe, his eyes fixed hungrily on the figure in the wheelchair by the window. In their desperation, none of them had noticed anything unusual about the way that blanket sat, or the width of the shoulders beneath it. "Do it!" Rhett hissed. "Now!" Fenn lunged, the needle glinting under the fluorescent lights, arcing toward the seated figure's exposed neck. The needle never made contact. In one fluid motion, the man in the wheelchair spun around, catching Fenn's wrist in midair with a grip like a steel vise. It was not a confused 74-year-old man. It was a 6'2" undercover police sergeant in a tactical vest hidden beneath the blanket. "Police!" the sergeant roared, twisting Fenn's arm until it snapped with a sickening crack. "Drop it!" Fenn shrieked, dropping the syringe as he was slammed face first onto the tile. At that exact moment, the glass doors on every side of the solarium shattered inward, and a dozen officers in full tactical gear swarmed the room, weapons drawn, voices overlapping in controlled chaos. "Get on the ground! Hands where I can see them!" Rhett froze completely, his brain visibly unable to process the sudden inversion of his entire plan. Cressida screamed as an officer seized her arm, yanking her back and away from Bo. "Don't touch me," she yelled. "I'm a mother. I have rights." "You have the right to remain silent," the officer said calmly, spinning her around to cuff her wrists. Bo stood frozen in the middle of the chaos, sobbing, terrified. Alden moved fast, scooping the boy up in his arms, wrapping his own suit jacket around his small, shaking shoulders, and carrying him quickly out of the room before anything uglier could unfold in front of him. "Dad," Rhett stammered, backing against the glass wall, hands raised. "This is a mistake. I was trying to help you. He attacked my doctor." I stepped out from behind the pillar at the far end of the solarium where I had been watching the entire time, dressed in my charcoal suit, no longer hiding, no longer pretending to be lost or confused. I walked through the line of officers, who parted for me without a word. Rhett's jaw fell open. "You," he whispered. "You set me up." I stopped 3 feet in front of him. I looked at his disheveled suit, his hollow eyes, his trembling hands. "I didn't set you up, Rhett," I said, my voice steady and cold as the marsh water at midnight. "I gave you a choice, every single day of the last 5 years. You could have walked away. You could have been a man. Instead, you brought a butcher into a hospital to silence your own father." I pulled my phone from my pocket and pressed play, turning the volume to maximum. The recording from the motel room filled the entire solarium, Rhett's own voice, clear and damning. We pump him full of sedatives, we make him compliant, we put a pen in his hand and guide his signature. The color drained completely from his face. The officers around him, who had walked in ready for a standard sedation attempt, now looked at him with open disgust. "Captain," I said, turning to the officer nearest me, "I believe this man just attempted to assault a police officer with a controlled substance in a public hospital, and I have a recording of him planning to have his own father chemically incapacitated for financial gain." "Book him," the captain said grimly. They dragged Rhett out, screaming that it was all a misunderstanding, that I was the one who had lost his mind. Cressida was led out behind him in silence, already, I could tell even then, calculating her next move. I did not follow them. I turned and walked back toward the small office, where Alden was already crouched down, gently wiping Beau's tears with the sleeve of his own jacket. "It's over, Grandpa?" Beau asked, his voice small and cracked. I knelt down in front of him, my knees protesting loudly, and pulled him into my arms. "Not quite yet, son," I said, holding him close enough to feel his small heart still racing against my chest. "But we're almost there, I promise you." It took Rhett exactly 4 hours to post bail, using a bondsman who accepted the title to Cressida's Mercedes, the one asset the trust had not yet reached because it sat, on paper, in her name alone. I expected him to run. Instead, he did something far more audacious. He sued me. The emergency filing landed on my desk the next morning, claiming I had unlawfully seized assets belonging to the acting CEO of Farraday Maritime Holdings, that I was suffering from acute paranoia brought on by age, and that my actions constituted a breach of fiduciary duty against my own son. He was not merely defending himself. He was trying to strip away my authority before the criminal case could gain any real momentum. The emergency family court hearing was set for 10 that morning before Judge Halston, a stern woman with no visible patience for theater. I sat on the wooden bench outside the courtroom, flanked by Alden and 2 of my own security men, my expression calm while my blood ran hot beneath the surface. Rhett arrived showered, changed into a modest navy suit, his face arranged into an expression of pained, wounded concern. Cressida walked beside him in gray, no jewelry, dabbing carefully at dry eyes with a tissue. They were in costume, playing the role of a loving, besieged family, and for one uncomfortable moment, watching them from the hallway, I wondered whether Judge Halston would see through the performance at all. Inside, Rhett's attorney, a smooth-voiced man named Blackwell, painted a masterpiece of fiction. He described a son who had sacrificed everything to care for an aging, increasingly erratic father. A father who had suffered a sudden mental break, drained the family's accounts in confusion, and staged an elaborate hospital scene to frame his own devoted son for assault. Rhett took the stand and wept on command, describing my birthday gift to Beau as evidence of a mind slipping into the past, describing the hospital confrontation as the terrified act of a desperate son trying only to bring his father home safely. "I don't care about the money, Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking with false emotion. "I just want my father back. I want him safe." I watched Judge Halston's expression soften slightly, and I felt Alden's hand tighten on my forearm, a silent signal to remain still and let the evidence speak instead of my anger. When Alden finally stood, he did not raise his voice. He simply pressed play on a recording taken from the estate's own library, weeks earlier, of Rhett drinking my scotch and boasting to a friend, slurred but perfectly audible. "The old man is a leech. He's taking too long to die. We talk to Fenn, up the dosage, make his heart stop. Who's going to autopsy a 74-year-old man? The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Judge Halston's expression hardened into something close to fury. Rhett stammered that it was fabricated, an AI deepfake, but the judge had already heard enough. She denied his injunction, denied his petition for guardianship, and remanded him into custody for violating the terms of his bail, pending the full criminal investigation into conspiracy. As the bailiffs moved to restrain him, Rhett's composure finally shattered completely. He looked around the courtroom for anyone, anything to save him, and his eyes landed on me. "He's not even my father!" he screamed, his voice cracking with a rage that had nothing left to hide behind. "He hates me because I'm better than he ever was." I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. He had meant it as an insult, a last desperate attempt to distance himself from the monster he believed I had become. But he had, without knowing it, opened the exact door I had spent 40 years quietly keeping shut. "Wait," I said, and my voice cut through the chaos like a struck bell. The bailiffs paused, their grip still tight on his arms. I reached into my jacket and withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with wax nearly 40 years earlier and never once opened. "Your Honor, the plaintiff has just stated for the record that I am not his father," I said, stepping forward. "I would like to submit a final piece of evidence." I slit the envelope open. Inside was a paternity report from a laboratory that no longer existed, signed by a physician long since deceased. I walked over to Rhett and held it up in front of his face. "Read it," I said quietly. His eyes scanned the single line at the bottom. Probability of paternity, 0%. The blood drained from his face so quickly I thought he might collapse where he stood. "I don't understand," he whispered. "Mom, your mother was a wonderful woman," I said, my voice softening only slightly for the memory of Lenora. "But she made a mistake nearly 40 years ago with a sailing instructor out on the harbor. When she found out she was pregnant, she was terrified, and she told me the truth herself on her deathbed. I made her a promise that day, Rhett. I promised I would raise you as my own, give you my name, my company, my love, and never once let you feel like anything less than my true son." I let that settle over the silent room before continuing. "I kept that promise for nearly 40 years. I gave you the best of everything I had. All I ever asked in return was respect and the simple decency of being a good man. You broke that when you stole from me. You broke it when you tried to have me drugged, and you broke it completely the day you left a bruise on your own son's arm to sell a lie to strangers on the internet." Alden stepped forward, his voice sharp and final. "The Farraday Family Trust is explicit, Your Honor. Beneficiaries must be direct biological descendants. Mr. Farraday here has no legal claim to the trust, the company, or the estate. He never did." Rhett made a sound that was half sob, half broken laugh. "I'm nobody," he whispered. "No," I said, "you could have been somebody. Blood didn't make you my son, Rhett. Love did. And you're the one who killed it." As the bailiffs finally dragged him out, Cressida rose from the gallery, her carefully rehearsed composure cracking under the weight of what she'd just witnessed. "I didn't know about any of it," she said, her voice trembling. "The DNA, the drugging, none of it." Alden opened a thick new file. "We're moving for an immediate indictment on embezzlement, Your Honor. During his tenure as CEO, Rhett Farraday misappropriated $4.6 million in company funds, disguised as consulting fees and equipment purchases." Cressida's eyes darted around the room, calculating, searching for an exit that no longer existed. "I'll testify against him," she blurted. "I'll tell you everything, the drugging plan, the forged documents, all of it. I have a son. I need to be there for Beau." I looked at the woman who had stood by while her husband bruised our grandson for a camera, the same woman who had called me a senile burden at a birthday dinner 3 days earlier. I nodded once to Alden, who pressed play on one final video, security footage from the estate kitchen weeks earlier, showing Cressida screaming at Beau over a spilled bowl of cereal, gripping his small face hard enough to leave marks, telling him she wished he had never been born. The courtroom went silent with horror. Judge Halston looked physically ill. "Your Honor," I said, "I am petitioning for full and immediate custody of my grandson, Beau Farraday. Both parents have demonstrated a documented pattern of abuse and criminal conduct." Judge Halston did not hesitate. Her gavel struck the bench so hard it cracked. "Petition granted, effective immediately." Both defendants remanded pending trial, bail denied for both. They dragged Cressida out screaming that she hoped I died alone. I did not answer her. There was nothing left to say to a woman who had spent 5 years mistaking cruelty for control and calling it motherhood. Behind me, Alden gathered his files quietly, murmuring that the FBI's white-collar unit would be filing federal wire fraud charges within the week over the offshore transfers, that both of them were likely looking at a minimum of 15 years apiece once sentencing came around. None of it felt like victory. It felt mostly like exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of a man who has finally set down a weight he had been carrying so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. I simply turned and walked out into the hallway, where Beau sat waiting on a bench beside a social worker, clutching his small toy truck. "Grandpa," he said, and ran straight into my open arms. 2 days later, we stood on the deck of a chartered yacht anchored off a private stretch of coastline in the Caribbean, far from Charleston, far from courtrooms, far from marble kitchens that had never once been warm. The water below us was a turquoise so bright it almost didn't look real, the sand along the shoreline blindingly white. Beau stood at the railing beside me, fishing line cast out into the calm water, laughing every time the reel gave the faintest tug. I sat in a deck chair nearby, watching him, feeling the sun settle warm across my shoulders for the first time in longer than I could remember. I had lost a son that week, in every sense but blood, and even in blood, as it turned out. But I had saved a grandson. It was a heavy price. I would have paid it again without a moment's hesitation. My phone buzzed once, a message from Alden. Sentencing hearing set for next month, both looking at 15 years minimum on the federal charges. Rhett is requesting a visit. I typed back 2 words. Request denied. I set the phone face down on the table beside me and closed my eyes, letting the sun and the sound of the water wash over me. "Grandpa, look!" Beau shouted, reeling in a small silver fish, holding it up proudly for me to see before gently releasing it back over the side. "Let him go. He wants to be free." "Yes, Beau," I said quietly, watching the fish vanish beneath the surface. "We all want to be free." Later that evening, after Beau had fallen asleep in the hammock, strung between the mast and the railing, I sat alone at the bow with the compass in my palm, the one Rhett had thrown into a trash can in front of 40 witnesses less than a week earlier. It had a small dent along the rim now, and I had decided not to have it repaired. I wanted Beau to see it that way one day, dented and still working perfectly, and understand exactly what that meant. I thought about the empire I had spent my whole life building, and about how I had once believed it was my greatest achievement. I understood now, sitting under that Caribbean sky, that I had been wrong. Money had never once made Rhett cruel. It had simply removed every reason he might have had to hide it. For me, that same money had become the one tool sharp enough to finally cut the ties that were slowly strangling what was left of my family. Blood does not decide who your family is. I had known that truth for 40 years and buried it out of love. It had taken losing everything to finally live by it out loud. I looked down at Beau, sleeping peacefully in the hammock, one small hand still curled loosely around the frame of that old silver compass, and I understood finally what true north had always meant.